John Kaldor, Director of John Kaldor Public Art Projects. We are coming together from around the world, and I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands across Australia. I'm speaking to you from Gadigal country of the Eora Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to those elders, both past and present, and extend my respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders people watching today. Welcome to this interview marathon as part of Do It Australia. Do It Australia is our 36th project, our first entirely online. Co-curated and inspired by Hans Ulrich Obrist, presented in collaboration with the Serpentine Galleries in London and ICI, Independent Curators International in New York, as part of Do It around the world. COVID-19 presented us with a totally new challenge and responsibility. How to continue to engage with artists and our audience in these difficult times. I turned to my good friend Hans Ulrich Obrist, and he came up immediately with the idea of Do It Australia. Do It is an exhibition that has run almost continuously since 1993. But in today's world, it has taken on a new meaning. The artist instructions challenge the audience to be part of the creative process, allowing people at home to remain active and engaged. And instead of bringing international artists to Australia, as we have done for over 50 years, we have invited 18 Australian artists to connect with audiences around the world. On Hans Ulrich's suggestion, the artists include architects, author, choreographer, florist, musician, and a philosopher, a creative portrait of Australia. I'm absolutely amazed at Hans Ulrich's reach. He pinpointed the philosopher, the author, from all the way from England. He knows Australia better than I do. The response has been astonishing. Audiences have relished the opportunity to, as instructed, to surrender, to work mindlessly, to stroke a living leaf, walk in the path of an extinct tree snail, chop a cucumber, recite the words of Rumi, and many more. 80 new instructions are on our dedicated webpage and online. I'm delighted to be joined tonight by Hans Ulrich Obrist and 17 of the artists who took part in Do It Australia will be interviewed. Gerald Murnane, Tracey Moffatt, Jonathan Jones, Glenn Murcutt, Latai Taumoepeau, Rafael Bonachela, Amrita Hepi, Khaled Sabsabi, Megan Cope, Brian Fuata, Ian Milliss, Saskia Havekes, Dale Harding, Thom van Dooren, Laurence Brincat, Janet Laurence, Nova Milne. Julia Jacklin, unfortunately, was unable to join us tonight. On behalf of our team, I would like to personally thank and congratulate these 18 artists for undertaking this new project. I would like to thank our supporters. Firstly, Bloomberg Philanthropies, our major project partner, whose wholehearted support made this project possible. Normally, it takes at least a year, usually 2 years, to put a project together. We put this project together in less than a month. I also would like to thank the Bell Naves, Naomi Milgram, and Nelson Foundations, Create New South Wales, and the City of Sydney. Thank you also to the copyright agency Cultural Fund, supporting our education program. Also many thanks to the Nielsen Foundation for their support. A special thanks to my wife, Naomi, who shares with me the trials and tribulations and joys of so many projects. Thank you. A special thanks to our board who support us in these difficult times. Our great team, our curator, Emily Sullivan, and digital and communication manager, Monique Leslie Watkins, who brought this project together. Antonia Friedman and Leah Smith, who have created a parallel program for education that has been a great success. And the rest of our team, Bettina Kaldor, Sophie Forbett, Eliza Ormsby, Michael Wade, April Murdoch, Robin Stern, and Louise Murray. I would now like to welcome Hans Ulrich Obrist, one of the world's most innovative and influential curators, founder of the Do It Project, artistic director of the Serpentine Galleries in London. Starting as a teenager, Hans Ulrich has made it his practice to interview artists, and these interviews by now have filled many books, telling the story of contemporary art. Now it's Australia's turn. Thank you and welcome, Hans Ulrich. You'll be pleased to know there are over 450 in the audience tonight from all around the world to listen to this interview. Again, thank you very much on our behalf, and we look forward to enjoying this interview. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. And hello, everyone. I'm very grateful to you, John, and your extraordinary team for this ongoing collaboration. Of course, all our gratitude goes to the artists. Very grateful also to Bloomberg philanthropists and everybody else who made this project possible. And today is really about listening. We want to listen to the artists who participated in Do It. We want to listen to their ideas. And listening has always been at the core of my project as a curator, with my interview project, but also with the exhibitions. We started Do It in 1993 with Bertrand Lavier and Christian Boltanski, actually asking the visitors to act, not only to observe. It was an attempt, really, and is an attempt to expand the field of curating and have an expanded exhibition, which started very small. It started with 12 instructions, and the idea was that is an application in a way of Edouard Glissant's idea of mondialité, that an exhibition can be global, but it is not about packaging, it's not about touring an exhibition. It's an exhibition which always is locally built. There is no transport involved, so it's also about sustainability. It is locally produced, and whenever the exhibition takes place somewhere, it involves a local research, and many artists actually join the project, which is what happened now with the Australian Do It. We are so grateful for these extraordinary texts of all the artists, and they have added a very important new chapter to the ever-growing archive of so far more than 400 instructions. So we begin now with the first conversation. I'm so happy to welcome Gerald Murnane to the marathon here for the first interview. It was always my unrealized project, actually, to meet Gerald Murnane, and we had wonderful conversation in the lead up to this marathon. I wanted to thank you, Gerald, for your amazing text for Do It, and ask you a first question, because you once referred to images, you referred to feelings and words as your holy trinity. You called it subatomic particles of your universe. I wanted to ask you how your Do It instruction gives us a glimpse into your process of writing.
Thanks, Hans. Well, it seemed to me when I began that project that I had to condense into 300 words what I had learned during 16 years as a lecturer and senior lecturer in fiction writing at Deakin University. So condensing the wisdom, I hope it's wisdom, condensing the wisdom of 16 years into 300 words was my task. And the three items that are most important in that little note that is part of the project, watching the images in one's mind to see which of those images flicker, wink, wriggle, in somehow convey to you a sense of urgency. And that links up with something that you didn't mention, which is my absolute conviction that fiction, if it's work, fiction has to be written. If I'm reading a piece of fiction and I come to the conclusion early on that it didn't have to be written, I stop reading. All my fiction had to be written because it was about images that signaled to me with a sense of urgency. One other thing, and I'm a little bit off the Trinity notion, but another thing that's important is writing in the third person. Writing in the third person creates a distance and an objectivity. If I were to write, I was sitting in an apricot tree, I would feel limited to drawing on my own memories or my own fantasies. But if I write, he was sitting in an apricot tree, or the boy was sitting in an apricot tree, then I'll feel free to draw on my imaginings, my insights, and add to that character far more than was ever part of my character. Make sense?
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much. And of course, the idea of writing, as you once said, and that's an interesting thing to visual arts and to the many visual artists whom we're going to welcome today in the marathon, has a lot to do with composition, how things fit together with the order, the reverberation. Can you talk a little bit about this notion of composition, which is a link to composition of a painting to visual arts?
Well, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable to think that I'm lecturing to visual artists, because I think my way of doing things, although it is a visual method, it mightn't be very common in their field. I can start a book with a single image. I'm going to show you the front cover of the first edition of Tamarisk Grove. This edition was published in 1974, and it has on the cover an image, a close-up image of a glass marble, a child's marble. My glass marbles are among my most precious possessions. I've had them almost all my life. Some people look at that image and think of it as a picture of the planet Earth. Others see a face in it. There's a rudimentary nose and a rudimentary mouth. That's all evidence for me that a single image can contain within it, or can suggest, multiple images. So I'm using my hands to suggest that the other images surround it, but they may also be contained within it. And this, of course, might be impossible to represent visually, but fiction is able to represent it textually and at length. And I can't emphasize enough the importance to me of proceeding from that visual manner, from the single image to the sometimes a galaxy of images that surround the first image. So that's basically, and I have this other notion, which I wrote about at length in a story called In Far Fields, which is in the book, well, it's in my collected short fiction. In that book, a teacher sits in front of a student and draws, I think draws on the floor or draws on a piece of paper, a map, which is a map of his own mind, which resembles a map of a country district where small towns are separated and linked, or separated from each other and linked by roads. And he says those small towns are images, and the roads that link them are feelings, images and feelings.
Thank you so much. Now, you have spoken of writing as a difficult and painful process, only actually overcome by the far greater pain of not writing. Yet the Do It instruction, I've been rereading it this morning, the wonderful instruction you wrote for Do It, has a calm, there is an encouraging tone. I wanted to ask you if this is an attempt to ease the pain and if it's directed to other writers, maybe also to aspiring writers?
Oh, look, there was so much more I could have said if I'd been allowed to go on for 3,000 words instead of 300. There is pain involved, not the pain that some people like to imagine, with torture and torment, but the pain of disappointment, that you can't do what you thought you might be able to do when you started writing. But don't forget how much history I've got behind me and how many achievements. I wrote that instruction with a sense of calm, and maybe I did give a false impression that my way of writing is a calm process. It's not always. It took me 10 years. That book that I held up a moment ago with the marble on the cover, that book took 10 years to write. And incidentally, the struggle to write it ceased to be a struggle only when I came up with that central image. But I think talking about pain is a false lead in a brief interview like this. I would like to just mention the supreme satisfaction that I get, and I trust others would get, when I discover that behind one image, which I thought was just an important central image, behind one image there lurk, there vibrate, there hide numerous other images. And I'd like to mention perhaps the supreme joy of all supreme joys that I've had as a writer. I have had the experience several times of looking into one of my books or thinking about it after it's been published and discovering to my astonishment that there were connections within the book that I didn't even know. I knew there were many connections, but there were more than I knew. And the surge of energy and sheer, almost spiritual joy that brings on is very difficult to describe.
And as it's addressed as an instruction in terms of writing, I was actually reading your instruction. I was also rereading Rainer Maria Rilke's Advice to a Young Poet, the wonderful little book of Rilke. And I was wondering, what would be your advice to a young writer, to a young poet?
Well, I've always used to give the simple, practical advice to my students, as they say in a proverb or a saying, don't give up your day job. I always was a part-time writer. I had the freedom. I didn't have to make money from my writing. It was hard to get published, but I didn't have to sell enough to pay myself a living. When I wanted to stop, or I didn't want to stop, but when I had to stop because I had nothing to write about, well, I stopped. That would be one piece of advice. The other would be true to yourself. There were a few occasions in my early career when I wrote less, or when I could have written a better piece than I wrote, but it seemed so far from the mainstream, and I was so isolated as a writer in my young years that I restricted myself. I'm free now to say what I want to say. So be true. Don't give up your day job and be true to yourself. And perhaps another one, stay calm. That instruction you keep talking about, the instruction on Do It Australia, one of the important parts of that is to relax and wait. Your mind, and I'm speaking now to some potential writer, your mind already contains enough material for at least one impressive work of fiction. Don't despair when you don't find that source at first investigation. Be calm and relaxed. Your mind is your great friend. And when I say mind, I mean more than psychologists talk about. My mind to me is a vast landscape that I've never fully explored.
Now, you famously stopped writing for publication and are very focused and preoccupied with writing for your archives, as we discussed the other day. I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about this shift and about your archive. Well, I stopped writing because I felt that I had finished writing. I had 15 books published. I'd said 90% of what I wanted to say, and I was tired, and I'm of a certain age where you're allowed to be tired. The archives have been with me for most of my adult life. In fact, I started writing, I didn't know I had an archive waiting, but I started writing a journal when I was about 15. Now, the archive will go on until
the day when I can't sit at a desk with my fingers pushing on a typewriter. So in a sense, they're sort of, they'll never be finished. The archives are in 3. And by the way, you can Google the 3 archives of Gerald Murnane and you'll find a summary of the contents of the 3. There's the chronological archive, which is my life story in documents. There's the literary archive, which is the story of every book that I've written. And then there's the Antipodean archive, which I kept secret for many years, which I'm not at all ashamed of talking about, in summary anyway, which is a world of imaginary horse racing. And if anybody thinks that horse racing is inappropriate for someone of my achievements, they don't begin to understand my vision of the world. If I were, by some miracle, taken to Paris, because I've never left Australia or even stepped in an aeroplane, if I were taken to Paris, this is going to offend a few people, but I want the opportunity to say it because it stresses the importance of horse racing to me. If I were allowed one day in Paris and I was allowed the choice of spending that day in the Louvre Gallery or going to Longchamps and seeing the Grand Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe, it would be a no-brainer. I'd go to the races. Does that offend you?
No, it actually makes me think of something you said in an interview, that a person can actually reveal more about themselves by saying what they've never done. And on that list of what you've never done is also the idea that you've actually not been to museums. Can you tell me a little bit about that list and about why it's actually important to know about what someone hasn't done?
Well, the most important thing I should tell people about is that those things that I've never done are very carefully listed in an essay. This is a book, this is the English edition of Invisible Yet Enduring Lilacs, came out just a couple of years ago. And in that is an essay called The Breathing Author. And the interested viewers only need to read The Breathing Author. And then I published a subsequent essay called The Still Breathing Author. This is a scholarly book published by the University of Sydney. And it's called Gerald Murnane, etc., etc. And in that there's a second essay, and there's a list of all the things I haven't done. It saved me a lot of time if I just referred the reader to those. Flying in aeroplanes, going to art galleries. Some of them are just things I didn't have time to do. Some of them are things I could never bring myself to do.
And I had a last question from the things you've never done to the unrealized projects. I'm always very interested in unrealized projects because we know a lot about architects' unrealized projects because they actually publish them, but we know very little about poets, writers, visual artists' unrealized projects. And there are, of course, many different types of unrealized projects. There are projects which are too big to be realized or too small to be realized, censored projects. My friend Doris Lessing in London, she used to always say, there are also the projects one hasn't dared to do. She called it the self-censored projects. And then there are simply the projects one hasn't had the time to do, the books one hasn't had the time to write. So I wanted to ask you if you could tell us about your unrealized projects.
Well, I have very few. There is a drawer in my literary archive, a filing cabinet drawer, and it's labelled unfinished and unpublished. And I'm not sorry that there's items in there that were unfinished because they were incapable, they were unable to be finished. They wouldn't have been worth finishing. There's a large item called, it was to be a book of fiction called Odium Golden Slippers. And it was never finished, but I'm proud of an achievement that in this sense that much of Odium Golden Slippers was used in Barley Patch. I thought for 10 years that I'd written something I could never get published, but deep beneath this failure, if you want to call it a failure, deep beneath this failure was a potential success. I was able to reuse the material or use it in a different way and made up the book Barley Patch. The other unrealised project, it's in a different sense. The Antipodean archive is, of course, a world of horse racing. And as Jack Kerouac said, the turf just went on forever. It was so complicated. I have the experience sometimes of deciding that a certain horse in the Antipodean archive will go out and have a holiday, a spell, and won't race for another won't race for 6 months in Antipodean time. And I stop and think, yeah, and by the time it has that race, I'll be 99 years old or 97 years old, and maybe I won't be around to witness it. So there's an interesting sense that I'm embarked on a project which I can literally never finish, an unfinishable project.
Such a beautiful answer, Gerald. Thank you so, so much. And I hope to meet you soon in person. Thank you very, very much.
Been a great pleasure, Hans. Bye for now.
Thank you so much. See you soon, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans.
It's now our immense pleasure to welcome Tracey Moffatt, one of Australia's most renowned contemporary artists. Is Tracey with us?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can't see you yet, but I can hear you. Hi, Tracey.
Hello, hello, Hans.
How are you? So
Chin,
nice
chin.
to see you.
Chin chin.
Yeah, so nice to see you.
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much for your instruction. We are so delighted. We are so delighted, quite delighted. You have written an instruction called Delighted, and it's actually a wonderful transition with Gerald Murnane's instruction, because your instruction has also to do actually with advice to other artists. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of this instruction and about work mindlessly on your current creation?
Yes, to work mindlessly. It's very important. With my work, because the images I create often are fiction and coming out of my dreams. And so I need the imagery to wash over me and to not think it through. Don't think it through, let it come. So that is always my approach with art making, and art making takes a long time. And so you have to put it away. Put it under the bed, Hans. Just put it underneath the bed for a little while. And then when you're vacuuming, drag it out again, have another look.
Yeah, it makes me actually remember my studio visit with Semija Berskay. Semija Berskay was an amazing painter in Istanbul and an opera singer. She now passed away. And when I visited her, she was in her 80s. And she said, my studio is under the bed. So she had literally dozens of paintings under the bed that were waiting, and then, you know, put them out. Now, your instruction at first seems to be a guide for artists, but there is also humor. There is an evasiveness. So there is a stepping away. Can you tell us about that?
What's that chatter in the background? Is that John Kaldor? Evasive? No. I didn't, you know, the brief was from you and from John Kaldor to give instructions. I didn't want to give instructions. I wanted to make suggestions on how to work, or how I work. And also it's partly about talking yourself into it. When you're making art, you're talking yourself into it. It doesn't just come when you're an artist. The work unravels. It suddenly appears. When I made the work for the Venice Biennale in 2017, it took me about 18 months, constantly changing the imagery around, printing it different ways, printing the pictures large, printing them small, printing them in black and white, printing them in color, taking the color out of them. It just kept changing. I was printing some on glass and so on. So it drives you cuckoo. And so it's all about sort of succumbing to the process. Try to not go too crazy.
It's actually another connection to Gerald, you know, because he was talking about this idea of waiting also, waiting for the creative act to arrive. Now, another thing I thought would be interesting to ask you is about documentary.
Documentaries, yeah.
Yeah, because you're not interested in documentary and realism. I once read in an interview, but you're more interested in staging in fiction. Can you talk a little bit about that and about this idea of seeing yourself?
That I have never been interested in realism, and that fiction and narrative is my thing. And yet I love the History Channel. I'm a television addict. I'm glued to all the documentaries on television. In the past, I've been invited to be a judge at international documentary film festivals. One was in Yamagata in Japan, and that was wild. That was incredible. Just to spend 3 days watching documentary. So although I admire it, it's not something I need to create myself. It's so inspiring. Just show me anything in black and white, you know, vintage film footage, and I'll be fascinated. Just let it run and I'll watch.
And I have seen your extraordinary pavilion in Venice. Can you tell us what you're working on at the moment? What is new?
I keep everything I do confidential, Hans. I do not talk about it. I am Scorpio, so we tend to keep it quiet. But I am making a big new photographic series. And at the moment, the images are now all around the walls in my apartment. So what I do is, the last thing I see at night are the images, and then I wake up in the morning and have coffee and stare at them. So that's quite good. I like to work from home. I have a couple of studios in Sydney, but in the end, I go back to working off my kitchen table. Just like we did as children in the house, we did our homework on the kitchen table. I can't seem to shake that.
And I found a quote from you where you once said that if you weren't an artist, you would be slashing tires with a knife. Can you tell us about that?
The violence in me, the frustration. No, see, I'm very active, and so Hans, it's really good to keep me busy. Thank God I'm an artist. That's all I can say.
No, it's a beautiful answer. Now, I just wanted to say with instructions, you know, it was actually do it. It's not at all instructions everybody has to follow. It's very much about the John Cage idea of open scar, you know, the idea. It came from Fluxus, you know, like when Alison Knowles says, make a salad, or Yoko Ono's cars. It's very much
I love the Yoko Ono book, Grapefruit. Grapefruit,
That's
right?
it, no? Yeah, that was the inspiration for Do It, yeah.
Oh, Yoko Ono. Yoko Ono, very underrated as an artist. Very underrated. Everyone hates her because of the Beatles. She split the Beatles up. No, Yoko was a great artist. What about at the Whitney Museum a few years ago when that sound piece of hers, you walk down the stairs and you just hear Yoko Ono coughing. That's all it was. It was just Yoko coughing. I loved it. She's underrated. Hans, there are many underrated women artists in this world today.
That's very important, and I completely agree with you. And Yoko Ono's work is amazing, and Do It really started because of her. When with Boltanski and Lavie we began the project, you know, the Grapefruit book was the inspiration. We thought, could there be a Grapefruit book as a group show in a way?
You've all got a Grapefruit book. I've got it. It's somewhere here.
Yeah, I've got many copies of it, all versions. Now, I wanted to ask you also about your unrealized projects, because there are so many different unrealized projects, and we know unrealized projects by architects, but not by artists so much. And there can be projects which are too big to be realized or too small to be realized. Some artists dream of, you know, feature films. Some projects are too expensive to be realized. Sometimes they're actually too small to be realized. Silvio Meirelles once wanted to do a little cube in a totally empty museum. It took him a long time to convince the museum to just have that little cube in it. At the same time, there is censorship, projects which are censored. And as I mentioned before to Gerald, you know, Doris Lessing always said, there are also the projects we haven't dared to do because
Excuse me, I love Doris Lessing. You knew her?
Yes. When I moved to London, I went to her house.
The Martha Quest series set it, you know, South Africa. It was South Africa or was in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, her childhood. Even from the opening lines, reminds me of my childhood here in Australia, in Queensland, the racist deep north that I grew up in. Very Doris Lessing. You're very lucky to have known her. Sorry,
Yeah,
yes, I do have unrealized projects. We all have. I have a big one at the moment that I'm trying to make happen. It's a big public art project for Sydney, and I have to find a lot of money. Hans, do you know anyone with money who might throw it my way?
And it's a public art project for the city?
Yes, but I need some private funds.
You have to tell John about it. The Kaldor projects are all about public art.
By the way, before you go, I know you're going to cut me off. I love the Serpentine Galleries, the architectural pavilions. I'm crazy for them. They're fantastic. The Frida one, the artist from Mexico, and and Francis Kerr, the African architect. I'm architecture crazy, so I adore them. And bravo to you and to all at the Serpentine for doing them.
Thank you so much, and bravo to you for all your work, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you so much, Tracey.
Cheers.
Delighted to see you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. See you soon. It's now our immense pleasure to welcome Jonathan Jones. I had the great honor to actually interview Jonathan already for the Kaldor projects when we worked on the book with John. I realized conversations with all the artists who actually did public art projects for John Kaldor. And of course, Jonathan did one of the great projects, public art, but today we are not going to talk about that. That interview is in the book of the 50-year anniversary. You have to remember also Christo here, who sadly passed away this summer. And of course, everything started with Christo when John Kaldor brought Christo to Australia in the very end of the 60s. Now, Jonathan, I wanted to begin actually with the instruction. You wrote this wonderful instruction about finding a stone that fits comfortably in your hand. Can you tell us about the genesis of your instruction?
Yeah, the project was really just thinking about grindstones, I guess, you know, the traditional ways of making grindstones, but which are extraordinarily beautiful objects, but through their shape. But there's something about that idea of that human touch, that regular, constant, rhythmic touch that can move stone, that can shape stone, which I guess is a very basic, you know, just sculptural way of working, but there's something about time and, you know, the narrative and the events that happen around that space that I guess I was kind of interested in.
And of course, the piece and the whole Dewey project happened during the lockdown. So it was fascinating that during that lockdown, you talked about connection, no?
Yeah, I think so. I think that idea of being able to hold something that's comfortable, hold something that has, you know, that you can have a relationship with, because I guess, you know, at the moment we are being pulled away from each other as individuals, as humans, but I guess in a strange way, that's where things, you know, like Indigenous ideas of being connected to everything and having relationships to everything can fill in some of those gaps for everyone else, you know, that idea that we can have really close relationships with plants and rocks and places, you know, probably will hopefully, you know, make people, you know, settle people down a little bit when we're in this moment where we can't have those physical connections.
Now, when we met in Venice for the interview about your public art project in Sydney, we talked a lot about language. I reread the interview this morning and it sounded a lot about language and the role of language in your practice. I wanted to ask you, tell us a little bit about that in relation also to the Dewey piece, which is a language piece, and also it's an untitled piece, but then it has a title, Jungi. Can you tell us about that as well?
Yeah, so this work Yangara, so it's this idea, it's the word for grinding, and it's the word for creating that you know, that shape, and it's the word that people have been using from, it's a Wiradjuri word from, you know, New South Wales, that people have been employing that Yangara, that slowly grinding something down. And I guess there's something for me in those, in how we use language, you know, and those different ways of understanding language. And it was, you know, really interesting listening to you before when you were talking about your curatorial approach being about listening.
because, you know, for Wiradjuri people, we have this word that for someone who's smart, or someone who's really intelligent, one of the ways we can describe them is this word that's Wudadurai, which is literally, if you take this word, it means having ears. So to be a smart person for Wiradjuri, it just means someone who listens, someone who takes the time and hears things, and that's how you measure intelligence. So I think it's in those moments where our language can kind of open up our imaginations, pry open those other ideas that we've had sort of sitting there. I guess for me, that's why language becomes such an important way of seeing the world.
Thank you. And actually, one thing also which came to my mind, another dimension of your Dewey piece, is of course the connection you have in terms of collecting artifacts and stone tools. You collect those objects actually as found by farmers, as well as also making your own. Some are found, some are made. And you've actually described in an interview I read these objects as our kin. I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit more about this idea.
Yeah, so I guess there's a few things there. So there's the process of being from the southeast, you know, a region that kind of so impacted by colonization. We often don't get too many opportunities to feel deeply connected to a place or to an object by virtue of the way the sort of colonial project, you know, picks everything up and tosses it up and sort of discombobulates it. So this idea of how we can find really deep connections. And so that's part of the instruction, this idea of finding something that feels comfortable in your hand. Often you can go to these collections of stone tools and they make sense. You know, they sit in your hand in a certain way, they fall to the shape of your hand. And you know, sometimes, you know, a really beautiful object that's been made feels like you're shaking someone else's hand. There's a deep connection that you can create with it. And I think particularly for me, it's been a way of connecting to those historical stories and being connected to a contemporary sculptural practice, you know, people making things, you know, your forefathers making things that you can connect with and fit in your hand. And so you somehow form a relationship which has so often been taken away from us. But and then this process that I've been, it's a kind of a strange process. So there are rules around the disruption of cultural heritage objects if they're found today on sites. But there are a lot of old pastoral families or people who have collected stone tools. And over the years, and I don't know how many years I've been collecting now, but just sort of connecting with different farmers, with different people and talking to them about stone tools or objects that they've found on their properties. And then often working with them and, you know, collecting them. So buying them off them, or often they come up for, you know, at other auctions or in other places. So trying to find some of those objects and reassemble them.
In Venice, we also spoke about the past and that the idea of revisiting the past. I was mentioning my conversation with Eric Hobsbawm, and you talked about researching and also confronting Australia's past, you know, to move forward. And you said there is an unearthing, and of course, you know, we discussed this, the importance also in your work of reactivating forgotten stories and practices, and that's something which resonates very much, I feel, in the Do It instructions as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, look, I think there's just, you know, there's just so much amazing history, stories and ideas that are sitting here in Australia that haven't been, you know, that are waiting to come out and are waiting to be woken up and waiting to sort of take form in people's creative ideas. You know, and hopefully through artists, writers, architects, everyone, all of us, grabbing hold of these stories sort of from here, we can help sculpt the nation and kind of come up with a much more dynamic and a much more interesting understanding of what it is to be Australians. And I guess for me, that's that real history, you know, and everything from, you know, those grindstones, the way they sing, you know, when you start rubbing the stone on them, you know, they make this extraordinary sound. And it's a sound that, you know, hasn't been heard for a really long time. It's a sound that probably was one of the most familiar sounds in Australia for so long, for at least, you know, over 30,000 years. That sound was ringing out every night, and yet it stopped. You know, what do we lose as a nation when we forget that sound? So I guess, you know, we sit at that moment where we can hold on to those things, and help us reimagine what we could be in somewhere down the track.
And that's such a beautiful end of the conversation, because the sound of the stones brings us back to listening. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I hope to see you soon.
No worries.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot. Great to see you. It's now our immense pleasure and privilege to welcome our next speaker. Thanks again to Jonathan for this wonderful conversation and for the wonderful instruction. And for those who want to know more, you can read the interview with Jonathan about public art, about his unrealized projects in John Kaldor's book. Hello, Glenn. It's great to see you again. How are you?
Very well, thank you. And how are you, Hans Ulrich?
I'm good. Yeah, it's been a long time. We met in Australia when I interviewed you, and I wanted to thank you for your wonderful instruction. And as like with the other speakers before, I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about the genesis of this instruction, about finding the vanishing light of a shadow catcher.
Yes, well, when John Kaldor contacted me, I had finished just by 1 week a most wonderful book called The Short Nights of the Shadow Catcher by Timothy Egan. And it was written by Egan, who is a Pulitzer Prize winner. And this book was also the winner of the American National Book Award. And it's an amazing thing about the life of a photographer who was born in Wisconsin, grew up in Minnesota, and he, at the age of 19, he was born in 1868, at the age of 19, traveled to the Pacific Northwest to Puget Sound in Seattle, where he set up a photographic studio. And he had met Angelina, who was the daughter of Chief Seattle. And he was able to finally photograph her, which was the most beautiful photograph. Very difficult to photograph the American people, the original people of the United States, the American Indians, but she allowed it finally after quite a lot of persuasion, which made him feel that it was very important for him to start thinking about taking photographs of the people who were dying out. And it was the most terrible thing for him to see this happening. And so he thought, how do I do this? And he decided he'd go over the Cascade Mountains out to Montana and come into some groups of the people. He always had with him an interpreter and his camera. He became extraordinarily famous during his lifetime, photographing the American Indian people. And he decided it was important to do 20 volumes of the book, volumes of folios of these people. He didn't know how to achieve this financially. And what he did was, he decided to J.P. Morgan, the great wealthy man of New York, who built the Morgan Library. And as you know, Renzo Piano did the major work on it in more recent times. And Morgan finally gave him the money to be able to get translators, He took his photographic equipment. He also was one of the first people to record the voices and language, and he brought this together. He tried to get funding from the Smithsonian. It was totally impossible to find that funding. They considered him an amateur, and it ended up that he became one of the great ethnographers of the United States, and the books are just extraordinary. Now, the fact is that the whole idea of the vanishing light of a shadow catcher is about the light source that defines, of course, for people of dark skin, a clarity that's so necessary to be able to capture photographs beautifully. And so the American Indian people classified him as a light catcher, and he was always looking for that light, and it kept fading on him. And what was important for me was to find the vanishing light of the shadow catcher.
Thank you. And actually, you mentioned Renzo Piano and the Morgan Library. I visited Renzo the other day when we worked on a Kaldor show, and we discussed a lot this, fleeting, ephemeral aspect also of architecture, of light and shadow. Can you talk a little bit about what you've just been telling us, and also this idea of the vanishing light of a shadow catcher, how it connects to your architecture?
Yes, well, of course, you don't see architecture until you have light. You can feel it, you can probably hear it, you can smell it, you can touch it. But to see it, you do require light. And of course, one of the great problems today, in my view, is that light has produced form, and form has become a discipline in itself. It is my view that architecture is a path of discovery. Any work of architecture that exists, or any work of architecture that has the potential to exist, is there to be discovered. And of course, today, with form being a prime element, we're tending to lose the whole idea of the rational. And I love the junction of the rational and the poetic. They are one to me. To be able to bring these together as something that is absolutely has clarity in its understanding of its function, understanding of its detail, understanding of every detail that is part of the whole. So the architecture for me is about the wondrous qualities of space, wondrous qualities of light. The form, for me, has always come as a consequence of these other things. I did a pavilion for the wonderful Naomi Milgram last year in Melbourne. And that building was entirely about having a rational basis, but not without the poetry. And the poetry is the connection between the building and the landscape. And on such a site that we had there in Queen Victoria Gardens, the important thing was to address the city and be able to have the landscape that could run through it. And the human sat in the middle of the building, also in the middle of the landscape. And so the connection to the landscape is very important to me. I love the idea of buildings that respond to place, that belong to where they are. I have only worked in Australia. I teach abroad, but I work, and my physical work is done here because I know this place well. I know very many parts of this place well. It is a remarkable landscape. There are many landscapes here. They are absolutely amazing. And to work in them is a huge privilege.
Now, one thing also which this leads us to, because we spoke with Jonathan before about listening, and Do It has, of course, a lot to do with this idea of not shipping exhibitions around the world and basically imposing shows from one place to the next, but Do It is always listening to the local context. And I remember when we met in Australia, you explained to me that you don't really want to build outside Australia. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about how important it is for you as an architect to listen to the local context where you build.
Well, I think that one of the great aspects, and for me, problems in our field, is a level of arrogance. And for me to go and, for example, to go to Finland and pretend I could design a building in Finland, I think is enormously arrogant. I think that unless one can speak the language of the nation within which one is working, one is not understanding the nuances, not listening to or understanding the nature of that place. Now, I can read some of the landscapes outside my own country. I mean, I can understand when you start to read about the wind patterns, the sun angles, the sunrise, whether the sun is in the northern sky or the southern sky, what the water patterns are doing. I can read the sort of plants and what sort of landform it might, ground conditions it might be. I can tell whether there's high water table, low water table. I can understand all those things. But what I don't understand is how the language will affect how people perceive things. And for me, I feel that I know my country best. I don't know other languages well. I used to speak Pidgin English when I grew up in New Guinea. If I went back to New Guinea, I probably could pick up the language reasonably quickly, and I would start to understand the quality and the mind of the local people. But also with the local people, there are so many dialects that have their nuances as well. So for me, working where I know best in terms of landscape, understanding the flora, identifying the trees, understanding how the trees are growing in certain places according to the altitude, the latitude, the temperature, the humidity, the wind forces. All these things are all part of understanding place in itself. These are the physical aspects. And then as Australians, we're changing. We've got huge multiculturalism here. The most wonderful thing that happened to this country was to bring in so many nationalities that have enriched the culture. But what is extraordinary is that the British background has been predominant in our working with the British background to enrich it with the other things. It hasn't changed that, but it has enriched it. And that is what's so beautiful. So the language has become enriched. The people have culturally made this place such a richer place to be.
Glenn, thank you so, so much. It's wonderful to see you again. I hope to see you soon. Thanks a lot.
My great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. It's now my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our next speaker, Latai Taumoepeau. Hello, Latai. Great to see you. How are you?
Hi, Hans. Good, thank you. Lovely to see you too.
Yeah, so good to see you. And I'm so delighted we met thanks to our friend Asad Raza, who when he came to Australia sent me information on your cultural activism and your amazing live work. And before we talk about that, I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about the genesis of your Dewey piece, In Continuum.
Yeah, so I think, you know, it was the beginning of isolation and self-quarantining, and I had done some work on pandemics, but I was reflecting on my great-grandmother who had died in the Spanish flu pandemic in the island kingdom of Tonga, which is where my heritage is, and I'd been reflecting on that, and maybe also you know, Arundhati Roy has a book called The Pandemic is the Portal, and I'd spent some time daily home, you know, online with my niece and nephew who live in the capital. And so I think a lot of that, plus my practice in movement and also the idea of the embodied archive is a huge interest of mine, and my own kind of cultural role as a keeper of genealogy in my own family, all kind of came into play when invited to be a part of Do It. And I was also resisting the, you know, as a live performance maker, I was also resisting thinking, you know, making works for online. You know, I was in contemplation about that as well, and thinking, I don't think it's something that I would rush into as a practice. And so Do It was a really great way for me to contemplate all the complexities around my own practice, as well as having an enormous amount of time and space to think about deep cultural aspects in my life, and how to do that with collectively, even though being in isolation. So thinking about the interior was, you know, a huge motivation. And yeah, I think that in Continuum was also suggesting that there was, you know, I wasn't being static, but continuing an exploration of practice that is always ongoing. And maybe how I often think about it is as a continuation of my ancestors as well. So I don't think I'm doing anything new. I'm in continuation of them, and will continue, which then sets up a practice of more cyclical time rather than, you know, linear time, which is, I think, part of how we were thinking about being in isolation during the pandemic, you know, being stuck at home, or being trapped in space. And I live in a 2-bedroom unit, so I was trying to think about, how do I have a sense of expansive space whilst being in limited space? So I wanted to really explore that and make that as an intervention, or you know, or a provocation, or a performance, something performative for one to do that wasn't about getting into your active wear and, you know, running laps around your local park, or, you know, excessive exercise, but more of something physical that was meditative. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful, because we got so many reactions for your Dewey piece, and it really got people outside this two-dimensionality of the screen. It felt like liberating people also from the screen. I wanted to ask you a bit more about the idea of the ancestors, which of course plays an important role in the Dewey piece, because I read that you return to the ancestral home and actually continue the idea of sea voyaging and celestial navigation before then becoming an ancestor. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think always being aware of our own mortality is a healthy thing, and it's also ordinary practice for my people. And I think actually many Indigenous people have a healthy relationship with their own death, I guess. But I think in this time of pandemic, I had been attending webinars with many First Nations scholars who were exploring these concepts of ancestry. And for me, as I was saying, looking at my own genealogy is also about accessing my own ancestry. But there were some really wonderful concepts that I was made aware of in some of these webinars with First Nations scholars, which was the questions around what kind of an ancestor do you want to be? And that really struck me, and it became an ongoing contemplation for me to think about that, which is not a new thing, but I think just the actual questions make it, I think are relevant in this time of a pandemic where, we're all available for, to become ill. And it really did make me think about what type of ancestor do I want to be. I think there are the very obvious things for me, which is my practice, which is movement-based. I did start in contemporary dance training and Pacific Island dance training. And I think that, so genealogy and ancestry for me is about accessing that kind of time ideas of the past, but I also, you know, look at proverbs and philosophies from my culture that look at time very differently. And so ancestry, my ancestor, my last name actually translates to battle with waves and is actually a title of an ancestor from my paternal side who was a celestial navigator. So that is kind of my clan's skill base that is a performing art. So it's not dancing, but it is a performance of the body, and it has a very specific function and practicality about it. And for me, to full circle of my life would be to practice this current practice that I have, which is expression of the body, and then to eventually become skilled in the performing art of navigation and traversing the Pacific Ocean without electronic tools. And that would be the ultimate performing art for me. So it's, yeah, for me, it's about that. That's my own kind of personal desire that is connected to a very contemporary practice that I have as a person who's the diaspora in Australia. I'm not First Nations Australian. And so, yeah, it's a way of sharing that idea through presenting a practice through my body for an audience.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And of course, it leads us also to your aspect of the dimension of activism, of cultural activism in your work. And Bruno Latour wrote this text quite at the beginning of the lockdown, where he said that maybe the corona crisis, the COVID crisis, is just a rehearsal for a much bigger crisis to come, which is the climate crisis, the climate emergency. And a very important part of your work actually looks at climate change, because you look at the impact the climate change has on the sea of islands within Oceania. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit more about this idea of climate emergency in your work.
Yeah, well, I actually the pandemic has arrived in the midst of the climate emergency, a crisis that we've actually been in for quite some time. It's already impacted many communities, low-lying islands, including the Pacific and island nations in Oceania. And so my practice since 2007 has been looking at the impact of climate change on the Pacific Islands and the communities that are still living on the Pacific, and also directing my work at people in developed nations like Australia and New Zealand, and asking the questions of what is our responsibility towards the low-lying islands, given that they've not contributed to climate change, and yet they are on the front line of climate change. So many First Nations Australians, as well as, farmers in Australia, and actually non-human life forms are already impacted. I think there's this centering of human beings that often comes, that is often the first thing that we think about, but actually we have devastated, the planet. And for me, I see myself as a failed community worker because I've always wanted to do community type work, but I don't really have any boundaries. And so I think once I discovered that I could use my practice to not just make awareness of what's happening, but as a form of an extension of the voice of people that are already impacted, so using the privilege of being a person that lives in a developed nation actually is why I use my practice to do that. And I think, I've been doing that for some time now. And I think I'm also developing a new mode of practice, I think now, like where I'm more interested in systems and seeing the limits of activism. I think in practice as well for me is something that I'm looking at right now. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And of course, that leads us to my very last question. I wanted to ask you about the unrealized dimensions of your work, if there is, in relation to your art, to your performances, but also to your activism, a project which has been too big to be realized, a dream, an utopia, a project maybe which was censored or self-censored. And I always ask this question because I think it's important that we get these ideas out there in order to help then for them to get realized. So it has also, you know, a very pragmatic notion.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is the part of where artists exist is in the unimaginable, and when we start imagining things, they can happen. And I think this is a very important part of what we do. I think for me, I absolutely love the process of deep thinking, deep listening in making the works that I'm making. But I really want to get more heavily involved in some of the systemic problems, because I think in order to make some real changes in climate change, some really big things need to change, and very quickly. And so my practice is always going to exist because I love it so much. It's what I believe I'm on the planet to do. But I think, you know, there's been a couple of times where I've been in other parts of the world where, you know, our voice is unheard of, you know, in other areas of the world. And so it's unfortunate that we have this pandemic, and it's, you know, disabling a bit of movement. However, there's, you know, that's what technology is for. But I do think that there's still a lot of ways that we can work in bringing down some of the systems that are creating some of the biggest problems that that we're seeing on the planet. And yeah, I think, yeah, there are some works that I'm interested in making, but we'll see what the future holds in terms of how we're traveling. Yeah.
I hope we can continue this conversation and explore together more of this very urgent topic. Latai, thank you so much, and thank you again for the great text and the great instruction. I hope to see you soon. Thank you.
So likewise. Thank you, Hans.
Thanks so much. See you soon. Bye-bye. Thanks again. It's now my immense pleasure and privilege to introduce our next speaker, Rafael Bonachela, who is a choreographer and of course also the artistic director of the Sydney Dance Company. Rafael, I wanted to ask you to begin with the beginning, the question I've been asking the other artists so far about the instruction, the open score, the do-it piece. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of finding yourself alone in a place?
Hi, Hans. Look, for me, it was really interesting because as a choreographer, I use a lot of tasks as part of my creative process with my dancers. It's a very part of what I do. So when John got in touch and said, look, you know, you need to think of an instruction that everyone could do. Absolutely everyone of any age and any capacity, you know, with you being a choreographer and dealing with movement. So for me, from the very beginning, that was a really interesting part of it, because I was thinking, how can I be as true to myself and my work as I can be, and be inclusive and provoke a physical action and provoke and inspire people to move, and in some way link that to some emotion. So I thought about it a lot, and how could that be also an experience for people that did it, and a connection to their own body. And I have to say that also, which has happened to other artists that have been part of this, that week, or, you know, we had been sent home. So there was also this idea of being between the four walls and reaching out and expanding out, and how it could potentially be cathartic, you know, for the person that did the instruction and the task. So for me, I came, at the end, I went to the visualization idea. So how to imagine a situation and how to respond to it with the body in a way that was open and people could, you know, interpret it in their own ways. And it was also interesting to go through the process of how much do I instruct, how much do I leave open. And I started with a lot more, and I kept taking things away because I just wanted to sort of entice people and suggest things without being too specific, because I thought that that would be, you know, the greatest outcome. So my whole thing was about, you know, breaking through light, you know, breaking through blinding heavy light. I thought about darkness, you know, I put different scenarios, but at the end, that's where I stayed.
One thing I was also curious is this idea of listening, because we talked a lot about Do It being about listening to a local context. I think in many of the previous interviews, the idea of listening was important. Etelatnan says, you know, in the 20th century, there were many declarations, manifestos. It's important for the 21st century to listen. What's the role of listening in your practice?
What's the what, sorry?
The role of listening.
Well, you know, there is the listening of your own body. You know, we all have our body. We all, you know, some of us use it more or less in the practice of dance. Obviously, you become an expert on your own body. And the more that you listen to it, the more that you dig into it. And when I work and I collaborate with dancers and I create and I choreograph work, there is a lot of listening to, you know, to your own body, to your own instincts, to your own impulses, you know, of what you want to convey, how you want to interact, listening to someone else, to the people that it's around you. And that's a sort of different listening, but one that you get used to through practice and through getting to know more, you know, who you are and how you move and what, you know, what are your, you know, what is your capacity to push your body.
And you run the Sydney Dance Company, and that means you work a lot with dancers. What's the role of instructions, open scars, the whole idea of Do It? Because of course, a very important part is this idea of those being open. There is not really a wrong way to interpreting them, as Yoko Ono once said, or Alison Knowles, you know, in Fluxus. What's the role of that in your practice? I thought it would be interesting in terms of choreography, because we have quite a lot of choreographers in Do It.
Yes, absolutely. Look, it's always, instructions and tasks are great because help me as a choreographer and the dancers to find new ways to push ourselves in places and in ways that we wouldn't have done otherwise. So for me, always, when I'm creating a work and I have an idea or a concept that I want to explore, I will always be thinking about tasks, instructions that I can give the dancers. And they can be visual, they can be text-based, they can be numbers, geometry, conceptual ideas, or more about sensations and feelings. But instructions and tasks are always a huge part of my development, because for us, it's a great tool to develop movement and situations and also worlds that will shape the language of the work and will, you know, will help to, you know, to go from what was nothing to what is the final work of dance, finding new paths and new ways. So I'm always looking for new tasks myself before I start the work. Some tasks translate from work to work, and some others come up as new ideas.
One last question, the unrealized project. Do you have unrealized projects?
Oh, well, look, there's many, and I think I have to say that every project that was to happen this year, you know, I hope that they will realize, because we were about to go on stage 3 days before we were to be sent home, you know, and to be able to have that sharing that we have with an audience. And that didn't happen, and I hope that those projects will one day realize. But for me, it's more about, I have this wish and this idea that everyone, you know, all of us should dance and should move a lot more and should be more part of our lives. So I do hope that that's one day a realized project, you know, that we all as people get to know our own bodies and move and dance.
Rafael, thank you so much. I hope to see you soon. Thank you. And thanks again.
Thank you.
Great text. Bye-bye. See you soon. It's our immense pleasure and privilege to announce our next speaker, Amrita Hepi, who works with dance and choreography through videos. And I wanted to begin actually with the beginning, and like all the artists, ask you, Amrita, to tell us about Precedent Piece, about the wonderful text you wrote for Do It.
Hi, Hans. Thanks for having me.
Hi, how are you? Great to see you.
So President Peace started because, I mean, originally it was just one word. It was surrender. I was wondering in this time, what are we willing to surrender? What are we willing to give up in order to go forward? What are we willing to change? And I was also thinking a lot at that time about, I guess, being a performer that works with their body, kind of, and to echo what Latai said, to resist the kind of immediate market-driven demand to completely go into the digital realm. And so I wanted, and I mean, I've been like Zooming my family. This had been feeding my own neurosis. And so I was thinking about how do we change and what are we willing to surrender while still trying to keep hold of something. And I kept coming back to this word, like a precedence that kept being flung around completely. And so I wanted to like continue to kind of enjoy or be in whatever moment we were in while not flattening myself completely. So I guess my resolve was to surrender, and hence this instruction came about. Though I definitely wrote 10 instructions before I got to this one.
So you wrote 10 instructions for the project.
Yeah.
Amazing. And of course, it has to do with language. And we spoke with Jonathan, earlier today about language. And as a dancer and choreographer, I was curious how you use language within your process of working. What's the relationship for you between language and dance?
I think that it's a really strong relationship, actually, because a lot of the time we'll say, well, dancing is what happens when when we don't need words anymore. But actually, there are very succinct language that comes across in dance. Talking to my analyst, maybe it is that you're always communicating with your body. And I remember talking to friends of mine, and they were saying to me, oh, my problem is that I always thought, if I was very articulate, then I could ignore my body. Whereas I think I had the reverse. I was like, well, if I'm very articulate with my body, then I won't have to grow up and realize that actually we need both of these things. And that I guess that there's like maybe the possibility sometimes for enigma in both dancing and in language in different forms. And that's the thing.
Sorry, yeah, there was something in the line. Can you now hear me? Because I lost the connection. Yeah, yes. I think we are reconnected. Now, also, we spoke with Gerald Murnane about archives, and your early work was concerned with the body as archives, which basically holds and transfers also memory, personal and collective memory. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and if it relates somehow to your Dewey piece? Because the Dewey piece, of course, compels the participant to change, to let go.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that there's still the use of the archive, or the use of the body as archive. Everything in it is, everything on our body relates back to an archive, whether it's the way, or transmission, whether it's the way that our eyelashes flick up to like deflect the sun, or whether it's how long our hair is, or all of these things a part of like an ongoing archive that the body then is able to, I guess, like physically project out. But then there's also too the transmissions that we don't even realize, these things that stay within us. Like, I mean, I think about it when I'm like, when I'm choreographing sometimes, and I'll notice how my jaw will react, which then reminds me of this, like the transmissions of kapa haka or any kind of traditional dance that are in me, or I can still feel it. It's like I'm like dancing through the people that have danced before me continuously. But in trying to achieve that and trying to go back to that archive, it becomes anew every time. So there's something about the notion of an archive in a body that can propel you, but also in trying to achieve it, there's something that changes each time. And that's the thing. That's the thing. It's like, it's almost like in trying to find it, we have to let it go.
Now also, as John said in the introduction, Do It is a very interdisciplinary project. And your practice is very interdisciplinary. You recently have been collaborating with a neuroscientist actually to create a bot. I was curious to hear more about that project.
I'm collaborating with a neuroscientist and psychiatrist and I guess a Lacanian to create a Socratic questionnaire as part of ACCA Online's commissions. We're seeking to answer the question, how does it feel? And the itness is what we're concerned with. I mean, how do we, in this technocracy or a technocratic society, how can we continue to refer to our bodies and to know what is it in the question of how does it feel? And so the bot will seek to answer that question, and it'll do that by, I guess, being a Socratic questioner, but also too by giving prompts. So it'll say, does it feel like this? And then there's a yes or a no or a little bit of this or a little bit of that. And so there's always some kind of prompt to try and uncover what it is in the question, how does it feel? Which I think is always ever changing and very much relies on the location of trying to find it in the body.
Last question is about your unrealized project. Can you tell me about your unrealized project?
I think my unrealized project is obviously there's multiple, but it doesn't have to necessarily do with art specifically. It more has to do with, I guess in some ways my project was to become like the Aboriginal Rihanna, or to become like an incredible athlete, or to become the kind of to continue to work in this medium of pushing the body and having that experience be communicated to audiences in order to have some kind of like magic communicated past that. So that would be, the project. I mean, there's also too like the desire to become a political economist, and then how to like pull that into art. There's nothing that's been censored yet, but maybe that's also too an ambition and an unrealized project. But
great.
Yeah.
But great, I hope we can continue this conversation and to see you soon. Thank you so much. Great to see you. Bye. Thank you. It's a pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Khaled Sabsabi. We're going to talk about mental floss. Thank you so much, Khaled, for this instruction, for this open scar, which actually invites us to recite Rumi quotes on a daily basis. Rumi was a 13th century poet and Sufi mystic, and actually I spoke a lot with Etel Adnan and Simon Fatal in Paris. They are great experts actually on Sufi mystics, and gave me books, and so I was fascinated that you took that as a topic for mental floss. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of your piece?
Good evening, Hans Ulrich. So when I was invited to participate in the Do It project, for me, Mental Floss 777 was essentially looking at the well-being of an individual within isolation, and about also about understanding or appreciating the other. And in this particular time and in this space where I decided to use Rumi's quotes, because in the West Rumi is very well known, Jalaluddin and Rumi, but people refer to him as a mystic, as a poet. For me, he's also an Islamic scholar, and this is important to the history as well, and about acknowledging the other. But within that there is beauty, and to find within the isolation of the inner and outer, which is tasawwuf, which is referred to as Sufism in the West. We always speak about the inner and the outer, the hidden or the seen and unseen, what's visible, what's invisible, the different realms that exist between this physical space and others that we can't see or comprehend. So this was a very simple idea to build on the individual and to give a chance for people to be able to reflect and find something within that is quite simple.
Now, throughout the lockdown, it became important for people actually to maybe have rituals of care. And I mean, Tarkovsky talked about that a lot, the filmmaker Tarkovsky, that we need new rituals. And your instruction is embedded really with 7 daily instruction. There is repetition, love, silence, self-worth, generosity of spirit, time. Can you tell me or tell us how you somehow bring attention and focus this idea of care through mental floss?
Sure, Hans Ulrich. I will attempt to. I think the idea of care is, you know, as simple as it may be. If we can't care for ourselves, then we can't care for others. And in time of this sort of uncertainty, you know, our human instincts kick in for the general well-being. And this becomes a mechanism of, you know, protecting not just ourselves, but our community, our families, and our surroundings. So this is what I used mental floss in order to do that. And I think, you know, just to break down the sensationalism of the idea, I titled the work Mental Floss 777. I mean, for me, I always thought, you know, it sounds like a hip hop track, something that is really sensational, or, you know, an advertising campaign. But it's beyond that. And once you wipe away the surface, then you're able to you know, in some way, find a way to in tune with your inner being and inner self.
Now, also, actually, Do It, of course, is a written piece, and the process actually of enacting is reflective, intangible, and, you know, difficult to document. And that brings us to something which is important in your practice, which is the unseen. It just sort of made me think, in terms of the Dewey piece, it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about the unseen as an important part of your practice.
Sure. I think that for me, the unseen, Hans Ulrich, is essentially about acceptance. It's about accepting not just your physical self, but also, you know, whatever constitutes to be, whether it's your spiritual self or whatever you may want to, you know, decide to call it. But it is about coming to grips with acceptance, but it's also about coming to grips with this idea of not everything, you know, can be comprehended. Not everything can be analyzed. Not everything can be understood. So there's always this room for you know, whether it's people refer to it as evolution, or people call you know, growth, or but yeah, it's the idea of, you know, this never-ending continuum that is neither so-called positive or negative, neither gender, and so on. So these are part of the work, I think. I'm sorry.
Thank you. I think we have a problem with my camera, but it's now working again. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Hans.
Khaled. My last question is the Unrealized Project. I spoke the other day with Etel Adnan. Etel said her Unrealized Project is to build a house. She always wanted to be an architect. What's your Unrealized Project?
Look, I think we are all unrealized projects until we are realized, and as whatever that may mean. So unrealized project is it's in continuum. So as long as you know, within the personal structures that I have at the moment, it's about continuations. Beyond that, we don't know. So
thank you so much.
you.
So it's about continuation. It connects to the do it text. Thank you so much. I hope we can continue this conversation. Great to see you. Thanks a lot. It's now my immense pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Megan Cope. Again, I'm grateful to Assad Raza, because Assad, when Assad did research in Australia, told me about the conversations he had with you, Megan, and I hope we can meet soon and discuss more. But today we wanted to discuss about Do It and your instruction and the genesis of your instruction. Can you tell us about your piece?
Yeah, I guess like a lot of the other artists in Australia, with the pandemic and being in lockdown, I wanted to somehow reconnect with, you know, with the things that we couldn't do, like go for a swim, for example. I couldn't go home to my country. And so, yeah, I wanted first for people to list all of their words that they think of when they think of water. And this is, I guess, firstly to remember the complexity of water and its various bodies, how it flows, how it's contained, all of those sorts of things. And then to go beyond your own memory and to connect with friends and family in a way that we could, and ask them to contribute. And then to meditate on that and remember, yeah, so for me, water is so important. As Kwanamukka people, that's our life, the salt water. It gives us our culture, it gives us our place, it gives us our identity. And yeah, so I guess I wanted to see other people's relations to water as well. Yeah.
And is there an ecological dimension? Because it's of course a list, and I was thinking of, you know, Georges Perec and the Oulipo group, the kind of poetry of lists, but also the question of the ecological dimension of waters. I mean, Torkwasi Dyson, for example, works a lot right now with architecture, urbanism, ecology, and water. And you ask us to examine our personal relationship with water, which is so important, and memory, which seems very, very urgent in relation to the environment, geography, identity. Can you talk a little bit more about that? The connection also to the environment.
Well, I can't do anything as an artist without lots of lists. So I think it felt like a natural starting point. But yeah, lists help us organize, I guess, how and identify how things are connected. And so when we think about things in an ecological context, everything is connected, it's not disconnected. So yeah, I just wanted to activate that process, that consciousness.
And there are lists, and then there are maps.
Yeah.
Actually, Assad told me about your maps, so I was studying, you know, researching it online, and you know, the study of historical maps looks into how economies were developed, and basically it connects again also to waterways. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of mapping?
Yeah, I mean, I look at maps a lot because, you know, for us, they are, you know, often colonial tools of dispossession. but they also illustrate the environment in ways that are quite, that are very abstract and almost the opposite to the way that we see our country and how we relate to it. So I'm really interested in this process, and often in my work I do that. I map in several ways. Like I map with challenging our sense of time, with illustrating a 5-meter sea level rise, and then also map with our language to reconnect and recenter Indigenous ways of knowing and seeing. So yeah.
And what about listening? Because in some of the previous conversations, I asked about listening. Do it has a lot to do with listening, also to the context where the show goes. But what role does listening play for your practice?
Oh, I think right now, I just made a sound work actually in Adelaide for the, but yeah, that's again, it's a map in a way, because it's looking at the sculptural, the assemblage of the elements. There's blasted rocks collected by the, geologic, what is it? They take the core samples to analyze the mineral content, of the land. So yeah, I got these rocks and then worked them together. And then I asked the musicians to learn the song of the curlew, because the curlew is a messenger for us. It tells us when someone is going to pass away. And so I wanted to kind of create that intimacy, not just with each other, but also with the land, and I wanted us to think about, if the land could sing, what would it sound like? So we do that through, process of deep listening.
Thank you so much. And one question I always ask is the question of the unrealized projects, because I'm interested in projects of artists who haven't been realized yet, and by talking about it, hopefully we can help to get them realized. Can you tell us about a project which was too big to be realized, or too small to be realized, or utopic, unrealizable, or censored, or self-censored? Many reasons why a project could be unrealized.
One thing I've always wanted to do is make a big garden that I could live from. This is a project that I want to do. Yeah.
Amazing. And have you made drawings already of the garden? Or?
So many. Yeah, I have a lot of sketches. Yeah, and my home also that I want to build on country. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe.
And how would the... Yeah.
So you'll be coming there, won't you? Maybe with us.
Yeah, I would love to see these projects, and I hope we can continue the conversation. And these are very short conversations, which are hopefully just the beginning, and then we can discuss these urgent topics more. So I hope to see you soon.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you so much. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. It's my immense pleasure. Thank you so much again to Megan. It's my immense pleasure to introduce Brian Fuata, who works in the improvisation of live performance and objects. And I wanted to begin with the beginning, Brian, to ask you about Curly's Figurants, Instructions for a Simple Email Performance 2020, and to ask you to tell us about the genesis of your Do It piece.
Sure. Hi, Hans.
Hi, nice to see you.
Nice to see you. I must acknowledge how wonderfully unnerving and intense this whole situation is. But the email performances have been happening for a few years now, for like the last 10 years. And for this project, I just wanted to essentially use the project to kind of sort of like find a way to turn the practice into a series of steps that were doable. And yeah. that's it.
And can you tell us about how it works? Because it's really an email piece, and it's interesting because, you know, Namjoon Paik once explained to me that art usually is made with a medium not at the very beginning when it's invented, but a little bit later. So he started to make art with TV not the day TV was invented. There was a bit of a delay, and then suddenly it could be used almost like it was very available. And email, of course, isn't a new medium anymore. So it would be great to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a total kind of almost kind of like romantic kind of redundancy of it. And how the emails came out was, which is interesting in light of the COVID isolation thing. It came out 10 years ago when I felt I was like culturally isolated, having moved to like a regional town 2 hours north from here. And so there was a kind of sort of, the emails became a kind of sort of like an immediate kind of sort of medium that kind of was able to animate my urgency to kind of like make some creative or aestheticized object, you know? Yeah.
And also there is something of, and I'm really sorry that these conversations are so short, but I hope they're just a prelude for longer conversations, you know, we can have later when we can all meet again. Yeah. And in a way, you have a background in theater, and there is a sort of an almost theatrical setting of your instruction piece. Can you tell me a little bit about the background in theater and how that inspires the work you're doing today?
Yeah, cool. Well, after a while, well, firstly, how the emails came about was that like they began as text, a series of like SMS texts on my Nokia phone. And like while I was in transit, living in this small regional town that was like 3 hours away, I was still working in Sydney. Long story short, I then would kind of sort of like make these like kind of like poetic or narrative kind of sort of missives on texts and then send them to everyone in my address book. And then while having my laptop there, I would then kind of sort of collate all of the responses. And what eventually happened, how the email performances eventually happened was that like, I then would collate all of these SMS texts into a kind of PDF or a body of an email and then send them out to everyone in my address book. And it was just a purely kind of sort of goofy thing to kind of sort of like feel artful and arty. Yeah, I forgot the question, sorry.
No, it's a good answer. The kind of role of theater, really. And I was kind of wondering, your inspirations.
Okay.
And I was curious who from theater also inspires you and the sort of theatricality.
Well, back to the other question was that like eventually kind of sort of finding some form in terms of the like communication of the email. I realized then that like the different fields of reception then had a similar structure to a kind of sort of theatrical structure. So the two field then became a kind of sort of like they became a co-performer, and then an audience was then made through the function of the BCC. I likened the BCC as the seats in a darkened theater. And so there was an architecture of the emails that like shared a similarity to the architectural design of how theater is experienced.
And you've realized a lot of pieces actually with performance, also with public speaking. And I wanted to ask you if there were any projects which were too big to be realized or too small to be realized, utopic projects, unrealizable projects, dreams, censored projects. What are your unbuilt roads? I was curious about the unbuilt roads of Brian Fuata, or the unbuilt projects.
I don't have any. I'm not that much of a future thinker. and partly because it's kind of sort of like impossible. And I think I live in the future in terms of like the practice of improvisation that is constantly kind of like in response to time and place. And so I don't know. I don't know in terms of kind of sort of like a framework of tenses, but we'll see. I don't know.
And do you have any, because sometimes the unrealized projects lie within the realm of public art, and of course, John Kaldor has pioneered in Australia for more than 50 years now public art projects, and very often artists have proposals for public commissions. Or do you have any unrealized public art projects maybe?
No, none, not really. No, I don't.
So
think,
it's not part of your methodology in a way.
Well, no, because it's like, I guess I kind of sort of have an adult ADHD practice that is just so impulsive in the moment. And so I'm always just like, I don't think kind of sort of before something other than just being in this direct situation. And
the direct situation
that's currently happening in the world that needs to be addressed, you know?
Yeah. Thank you so much. I hope we can continue soon.
Yeah.
Great to see you. Thank you. Bye. Thanks so much. Thank you again, Brian. And now we are delighted to welcome Ian Milliss. I wanted to thank you so much, Ian, for the wonderful text, the wonderful piece, Understand Your Culture, One, Count the Ads. I wanted to begin with asking you about the Do It piece and how you see media and advertising as a kind of a lens for understanding contemporary culture.
G'day, Hans. Good to meet you. I suppose what I was thinking of at the time, in fact, was a lot of my work involves looking at really small things that you could do that might sort of lead to or unleash much bigger things and bigger understandings. And often this is about looking at things which are just so obvious that they're just immersive and people don't even really notice they're there, right? And I think the sheer pervasiveness of advertising is one of those things, and yet it's advertising which more than anything, far more than the art world, for instance, is actually generating the cultural values that we operate by. Right. And if we would actually do anything about that, first thing is just notice that it's there, right? We all notice it, we're annoyed by it in lots of ways, but seriously notice it, seriously, you know, measure it, look at it, examine it, you know, observe it really clearly. And so I thought this is a chance of doing that. It's impossible to do, you know, the instructions as I actually put them there, because it would take up your whole life. You know, you couldn't do it. You wouldn't, the whole rest of the week, you know, you wouldn't be able to do anything but, because that in itself tells you how pervasive advertising is.
Now you have a particular interest in journalism, I read, and in the relationship between journalism and art. And there is something of an assignment for audiences, an almost journalistic assignment for audiences. Can you tell us about that, how it connects to journalism?
Well, way back, I mean, I started out as a sort of formalist painter in the 60s, right? And then, you know, became, that slid into a sort of rather formalist sort of conceptual art. But I was always trying to work out a way of getting that more engaged, you know, with the world in some way or another. I mean, I came out of a generation where I could have been conscripted into the Vietnam War. So, I mean, I wasn't, you know, like, I was always, you know, involved in some sort of early activism or whatever. And I started to think about, you know, what are the things that actually create social values and cultural values, right? And in Australia, at least, they were religion to some extent, like probably everywhere in the world, it's religion to some extent. It was journalism, and it was the trade union movement, as it happens, which was responsible for most of the best politics in Australia and the most egalitarian politics like that. And so I developed a way of at least doing, you know, combining the journalism bit and the trade union bit together, and started working with trade unions and doing campaigns with them and running their newspapers and whatever. And at the point that I started doing that, of course, the art world decided I'd stop being an artist. And you know, no matter how much I tried to argue what I was doing was actually sort of cultural activity. People just tended to sort of just close their ears and not listen. But from that point on, journalism was a really major interest for me, and media in general. I mean, what's art? What's the art world? It's just a type of media and a type of distribution mechanism and a marketing mechanism for that. And so I just started looking at other distribution mechanisms and other other forms. And it seemed to me really that there's really not a lot of difference between journalism and art. Just for starters, there's not a lot of difference between a lot of things and what turns up in art. In fact.
Now, your practice has also been driven over many years by a necessity and for progressive political and social change. So I want to ask you to tell us a little bit about change and the importance of political and social change in your work, and maybe connected to that, also ask you about your unrealized project. I wanted to ask you if you have a project to change or a project of change which hasn't happened yet.
Well, when I started thinking about what is it that's interesting about art and why do we do it, I mean, it seemed to me that in fact it had nothing to do with particular media or whatever. It was about understanding the world and in a sense catching things that were really just, it seemed like just a little sort of straw in the air, but we're going to turn into bigger things in some way or another, having these senses about the way the world was going and the way in which humans had to keep changing all the time to progress forward all the time, right? And so I sort of turned the whole definition of art on its head, in a way, and stopped worrying about the art world and what artists were and started looking at, well, who were the people who did these cultural things? Who were the people who made these cultural changes? And they could have been using any medium. They could be farmers, they could be all sorts of things, right? And so I started to basically look at all these other activities, and in the process, of course, I got involved in a whole range of activist areas along the way. The most important early one was the Green Band movement, which started in Australia as a way of sort of saving heritage buildings, but ended up, in some ways, it created the Green movement in Germany, for instance, because Petra Kelly who was in Australia at the time the Green Band movement was going on, and it was trade unions refusing to knock down buildings and build buildings that the community didn't want. The community expressed its opposition to. She took that back to Germany, and that eventually, in a sense, became the German Green Party. So a small little thing that happened in suburban Australia eventually influenced politics around the world, and that made me realise that how activism could actually spread out like that, and cultural activism could spread out. And so, in terms of projects that never happened and never got done, well, I mean, I ended up having a hell of a lot of them as a result of one sort or another. I mean, in the late 1990s, I went to live in a coal mining area where I'd spent a lot of my childhood as a way of thinking, well, if you want to do something about climate change, you've got to actually go to the places where people are dependent on creating climate change and deal with them and deal with their lives and, listen to what their concerns are and try and work ways out of that. And that, in a sense, failed, but it resulted in another organisation which was set up with friends of mine called the Kaldor School of Cultural Adaptation, which in fact now works with farmers doing innovative farming projects. And so that's a failed project which turned into a working project. I suppose if I had to say what huge project have I got that hasn't happened or whatever, it would be just simply, to create a just society, an egalitarian, ecological, sustainable society. And everything I've done along the way has just been an opportunity of some sort that's popped up in front of me to work towards that in some specific sort of way.
It could not be a better conclusion, Ian. Thank you so much. I hope we can continue this conversation, continue to exchange. Thank you very much. And thanks again for your wonderful text. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. So my immense pleasure and privilege to introduce our next speaker, Saskia Havekes. As John Kaldor said, Do It is a very interdisciplinary projects. So we're very delighted to welcome Saskia, who is an internationally acclaimed florist and author and the founder of Grandiflora. And of course, the idea of florist practice connects very much to the idea of the ritual. We quoted in previous conversations today the importance introducing rituals or reintroducing rituals, as Tarkovsky said. Saskia, can you tell us a little bit about your Do It piece and how it connects to rituals?
Yes, thank you so much for having me here today. I feel very nervous actually. But rituals, I came up with my concept, my circle with nature, really through the Kanang Sari, which is a basket of flowers, an offering in Bali, that I'm sure many people have, well, everyone would notice that if they've been to Indonesia, to Bali, these beautiful offerings. Wherever you go, wherever you tread, you always see one of these little beautiful, colourful constructions on the floor or in a temple. And they're really there as a daily ritual of thankfulness. So I wanted to get people to really think about appreciation and the fact that these little offerings are made productively with from the heart. And circles in nature occur naturally everywhere. So to be observant of that, and the more you think about making a circle with nature, the more you see these circles everywhere. So in the planets, in the celestial bodies, in tree rings, in raindrops, in fish scales, in many, many flowers, there are so many beautiful circles. So just bringing people's attention back to really honouring nature, especially in this time of terrible crisis. And that's what I do every day in my practice. I'm always working with beautiful organic materials. And that's where I came up with my concept.
Now, the response to your Do It piece, like to many other of the Do It pieces, was phenomenal. And I would like to thank actually foremost, of course, the artists, but also above all the participants from all over Australia, from all over the world, who have sent in such amazing interpretation of the Do It pieces. And I was looking this morning, I mean, people from all over the world have actually created their circle in nature. How did you feel about all these this feedback?
Oh, well, I really was completely and utterly overwhelmed and very, very touched, like truly. I mean, in my work every day, I touch people's hearts, and people come to me for so many different prominent occasions in their life. So people come to me to talk to me about their funerals or about their weddings or about gift bunches for all sorts of occasions. And as I get to read everybody's words that go with those emotional offerings, it always touches my heart. But the Circle project was probably even deeper because it was my own activation, and I was really blown away that it went so far afield. I mean, I had it sort of started, and then I could see that it was like a domino effect much further afield, which was the ultimate compliment to me. I was just so touched that people wanted to get out into nature and really practice that. Making a wish made it a very positive, a positive experience, and to step into a natural form and just have the time to think about creating that for yourself, not having it made for you. Because in my work, a wreath is obviously, it symbolises death most of the time. But putting a wish inside of it began to make it a lot more positive in its process.
And it has, of course, also a lot to do with care, acts of giving and care, the idea of flowers. And I was wondering, because the only recurrent question in all my conversation is about the unrealized projects which have been too big to be realized or too small to be realized.
Many.
And I was wondering, I've never asked a florist about unrealized projects. I mean, you did a lot of collaborations also with artists. You worked on Jeff Koons, Kaldor projects. You've realized many also gigantic projects, many also very intimate projects. But what are your unrealized projects? Can you give us some examples?
Well, I have, I've got great ambitions for doing amazing projects with flowers and with greenery. I'd love to throw a blanket of flowers over many things at the moment in a therapeutic way. I'd love to be able to create something that was a floral form, but a more permanent piece surrounding the concept of this circle with nature as a recognition of the time that we're involved with at the moment. So maybe a collaboration with some other artists where we could come up with a beautiful circle that was a more permanent piece. And perhaps that could be rolled out in many different countries. I think it would be a wonderful recognition of the time that we're all enduring and a process of self-discovery, because we're all in our rebirth phase at the moment. We're all turning into something else. So something to signify that, I think, would be an amazing collaboration throughout the whole world, a wave.
There could not be a more wonderful conclusion, Saskia. Thank you so, so much. And I hope we can continue and meet soon in person. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again for everything. Bye-bye. It's now my immense pleasure, and thanks again to Saskia, to introduce our next guest, the artist Dale Harding. Dale, we met some years ago in Liverpool when I saw your extraordinary work with Sally Talent, who curated it in the Liverpool Biennial. And that was our first conversation. Thanks again for your great piece for Do It, which has to do with water, but in a different way than we discussed water earlier today in interviews. It has to do really with something Italo Calvino, I felt, once said when he said that art can make the invisible visible. Can you tell us about the genesis of your Do It piece?
Sure. Hi, Hans Ulrich. It's great to see you again.
Hi, great to see you there.
Hi. Of course, for me, I can't begin the conversation and talking about this project, this Do It instruction without acknowledging Megan Cope's work. So Megan's been working over a long time to embed language back into the landscape here around Southeast Queensland. And so, as well as my own sensibilities, that has informed my looking at and my experience of the landscape here around Brisbane on Turrbal and Jagerapool countries. So with a combination of different input, the sensibility is to look at it and to try to be with and to have some understanding of what the land is around where I'm at. And particularly during the COVID lockdown, speaking with John and Emily and discussing about a democratic or an accessible way of making a contribution or an action, I wanted there to be something that was grounding and considerate of where perhaps you might be. And for me specifically, often I'm sitting somewhere and looking with a strong connection to another place and considerate of what that pull is, but also doing my best to be aware of where I'm at.
Now we discussed with Latai about ancestors, and that's something we also discussed with you in Liverpool in our conversation. Yes. And we talked about your amazing wall drawings. And the piece, of course, you did for Do It has also a relation to that, because you talk about prioritizing languages that have come before you in order to, something I found in previous interviews, in order to extend actually cultural forms and practices of your ancestors. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. For me, one of the things I look forward to is that the ongoing evolution or the movement of cultural practices, particularly, as I say, if I'm looking at and reflecting on a landscape and a place that has a living culture and a living ancestral connection that I don't have an immediate understanding or connection to. I'm interested in how I might be here, but also how forms of those who are maybe living in diaspora or living away from where they originate, or their cultural selves or their ancestral lineages, how those forms might live on and be brought in ways that are good, are considerate, and that also are moving forward in ways that young people particularly can see themselves reflected in. Yeah, so in terms of ancestral lineages and connections, I'm interested in how we can use contemporary art, use contemporary art to embed and to further cultural languages. So that's particularly visual languages for me. Working with the communities and my family immediately, I've wanted to establish a visual literacy for the cultural languages and the visual languages that exist in areas that are largely undermining in agriculture at this time. And so there are many people who have responsibility or identification and a deep love to see those visual languages go further, but also building a visual literacy is a beginning point for me, I believe.
Now, I found the notes actually this morning from our Liverpool conversation, and we talked there about making visible the invisible, and you said something very important. You said that it's not only about making the invisible visible, but it's also about resistance. This idea of making visible being a constructive mode of resistance. Can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, Hans Ulrich. Resistance. I mean, how many conversations could you and I or anyone in tonight's dialogue have around resistance? And for me, constructively resisting, I may have been resistant, which has been unconstructive or even destructive in previous parts of my life. But I'm really interested now in how I might resist the forces that are seeking to undo or to make less what I'm committed to and what I'm motivated by. What are ways that I can resist those forces and resist them in ways that are constructive, that are generative, and that might be enabling or encouraging or supportive or inspirational, perhaps. Certainly, as I say, Megan's work is inspirational to me, to my do-it instruction, but constructive modes of resistance are around, for me, what can I do, or what can I build as a mode of resistance? What can I generate? What can I do and bring into the world that resists some of the forces which are seeking actually to destruct or to undo what I'm motivated by? Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to ask you as well the question I've been asking throughout the evening about the unrealized project, because I always think it's important to listen to unrealized projects and hopefully help them to get realized. And there are many reasons why a project can be unrealized, too big to be realized, too small to be realized, too topic. Some projects are unrealizable, some are censored. Doris Lessing said there are certain projects one hasn't dared to do yet. There are, of course, also, I mean, in the context of Kaldor projects, which is pioneered public art, there are a lot of unrealized public art projects, commissions, many, and I forget a lot. These are just a few of the examples why projects are unrealized. Do you have unrealized projects you could tell us about?
I do. And Hans Ulrich, my mum as a maker through my whole lifetime has called these UFOs, unfinished objects. So she calls them UFOs that float around the house and around her studio. But in terms of unrealized projects, yeah, there's many that I would love to do, and similar to Tracey Moffatt, actually, I'd like to keep them in a little bit precious until they start to have momentum. But surely for me, unrealized projects would be those young people around me, particularly the little children who are forming a sense of themselves as First Nations or Aboriginal or any way of identifying yourself. Those young people around me having a sense of who they are, where they fit, and what's valuable about who they are. So an unfinished project for me is the continuation of cultural practices and the generation of new cultural practices, actually, that see younger people moving forward with a greater sense of creative self, of expressive self, and of cultural self, which then from contemporary art and other discursive, discourse might come from, but living and being a cultural self, that's the one I'm really seeing as an unfinished project over a lifetime. Yeah.
Wonderful. That could not be a better conclusion. I hope we can continue our discussions about these urgent topics very soon in person. And thank you so much again for the wonderful Dewey piece. Thanks so much. Great to see you there.
Take care.
Thanks so much. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks again to Dale. It's now my immense pleasure to introduce Thom van Dooren. Actually reading Vincent Després. During the lockdown, I came across Thom's work about extinction, and it connects to many of the previous conversations we've had tonight, the extinction crisis. And I wanted to have many questions related to that and related to your writing, Thom. But I wanted to begin with the beginning, actually, to ask you to tell us about the snail walk, the piece you did for Do It. Can you tell us about the genesis of this work?
Yeah, thanks very much, Hans Ulrich. It's great to be here, and I'm sure this is much more of a marathon for you than it is for the rest of us. So thanks for making all the time.
Thank you.
So yeah, the snail walk is was a great challenge for me. I'm a writer, philosopher by training, so this is not a genre that I've worked in before. But as you said, extinction is the focus of my work, and so I took this as an opportunity to try and create a space for connection between people who wanted to take this up, and one of the species that has really captured my attention over the last 5 years or so. So that's this particular Hawaiian tree snail species, Achatinella apex fulva, which is now extinct as of last year. So the walk was an effort to try and imagine ourselves into this disappeared way of life to create a kind of embodied connection. So there's a lot more I could say about Hawaiian snails and how incredible they are and the kinds of worlds that they inhabit. But I guess at the heart of a lot of what I've been writing and thinking about is how to create openings into for people to better understand and appreciate these disappearing ways of life. And so the walk was, yeah, really for me a very new effort to try and make those kinds of connections, to gesture towards, I guess, one very small part of the life of these disappeared snails, this nightly foraging journey that they went on, and probably in the millions, a path through the forest that's now missing. And I think just getting a little bit more of an appreciation of the way of life of these snails helps us to appreciate these layers of what is missing from the world with extinction.
And of course, Vinciane Desprez, through whom I actually found your texts, because she refers to your books frequently. Vinciane talks about the importance of listening to animals. So I actually started during the lockdown a series of conversations with animals. It was prompted by Vinciane. How do you and Vinciane Desprez connect? Have you met, or is she just referring to your work?
No, we have met. I don't know if we had at the time. We've been now working together, and we've written together now for the last once or twice in the last couple of years. But she is one of my favorite philosophers, so it was an incredible honor and surprise, and I was delighted to be referred to by her in that interview. So yeah, she for me is one of the most exciting philosophers out there, who's challenging us to really think about how animals make sense of their worlds, how scientists construct knowledge about animals, and to really slow down with the cultural assumptions and the gendered assumptions that have framed how we produce scientific knowledge about animals, but also how we relate to them and value them. And so yeah, she's a wonderful philosopher, and someone I would very much encourage people to read.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, another thing I wanted to ask you has to do with going kind of beyond the world of academia in terms of publishing, to write for broader audiences, because we're doing these campaigns. At the Serpentine, we keep inviting artists. It's called Back to Earth, and it's artists doing environmental campaigns. Began with the Create Art for Earth campaign. We working with Jane Fonda and Judy Chicago, and also Swoon, a campaign of environmental art, and that's going to continue over the next years. And so we're very interested in getting these campaigns beyond the art world to have an impact as broad as possible. And you do the same with text, with writing. I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you do that, and about the importance, basically, of writing for broader audiences about these extremely urgent topics.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. It's not something we're trained to do as philosophers, or really as academics more generally a lot of the time. So, but that's been a real emphasis in my work, is trying to. I see myself as a storyteller and a field philosopher. So to really talk to people, to talk to scientists, to talk to Indigenous communities, to try and, in my case, explore extinction in a kind of thick way, to give a picture of what it is and why it matters, and then to do that in a way that people can actually read and or experience and make sense of. So I'm actually just finishing now my first trade book, my first book for a general readership, and it's all about the Hawaiian snails. So it's something that I'm trying to do more and more of, and also in other media. So I'm also at the moment just finishing with my friend Jane Ullman our first sound work. It's an audio montage documentary that again explores the snails in a kind of rich soundscape to try and draw people into their disappearing world. So I think there's a lot of different media in which it can be done. Obviously writing is the one that I'm most familiar with, but I think there are many ways to tell stories. So I'd love to talk to you more about this, Hans Ulrich, and yeah, I think there's great opportunities to play with storytelling creatively to engage different audiences.
I also hope that this is only the beginning and that we can continue to discuss these topics in many more conversations to come. My last question, I mean, you've just finished your book, but I have my days. I wanted to ask you about your unrealized projects.
Yeah, well, maybe I guess I imagine and dream in quite bite-sized chunks. So I have many ongoing projects that I'm working towards, no big grand unrealized one. When I finish with the snails, which will still occupy me for another 6 months or so, I think, my next big project is working with scientists who are in very different ways all over the world, exploring how they can teach animals to live differently. So these are animals they're teaching to avoid predators, or teaching them to relearn a lost migratory route, or to relearn a lost song that is impacting on their breeding because they can't form relationships because they don't know their songs. So in all these ways, over the last 10 years in particular, I think there have been new possibilities for conserving animals emerging out of new kinds of interspecies knowledge, new kinds of interspecies intimacy and embodied practices that scientists are really just beginning to experiment with. So I'm really interested in how we are beginning to use these kinds of pedagogical interventions to better conserve animals. So that's my next big project.
Tom, thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon. Thanks a lot.
You too. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks again to Tom, and it's now our immense pleasure to welcome Lauren Brincat. And I would like again, of course, to thank John and John's extraordinary team at the Kaldor Public Art Projects, because the whole process, of course, has been a process really of dialogue and the amazing research the team has done. And I remember at the very beginning of the research, John and John's team mentioned Laurence's work, and the idea that actually, Lauren, your work often begins with a scar. Not only your work for Do It, but many of your other works. Can you tell us a little bit what draws you to working with a scar?
I think I've always been interested in sound. I'm drawn to working with sound, and I guess I'm not a trained musician, but I work with a lot of musicians and I collaborate a lot. It's a part of my practice. And I think I write music through text. So I start with the text and then I collaborate with, last piece in Carriageworks, Other Tempo, collaborated with a group of female drummers and a composer to realize this text score. So I guess that's where I start, and then the work kind of evolves from there. But this kind of recipe piece, I think it's not so unusual for me, but maybe it's a little bit different from all my other works. Yeah.
It's called Recipe Piece. I have it here in front of me. Can you tell us about what prompted the piece, and tell us about the piece and the title?
So it's a piece, I guess, that's been passed down from my great-grandmother, but I didn't know this at first. I grew up with this piece, and it's a simple, I guess, gesture of connecting, where someone will be in the kitchen as a family, and someone will be cutting a cucumber, and then one end of a cucumber will be placed on a forehead, and then the other end onto whoever was in the kitchen, and this conversation would just continue normally, but with cucumber pieces on our forehead. And at first I really thought this was a Greek tradition, because my family background is both my parents were born in Egypt, but my mother's Greek and my dad's Italian. So I just thought this was this Greek tradition, but actually it was just a family tradition that we've been doing for years, and that now I do with my daughter. So I thought when Emily asked me if I wanted to be a part of this, do it, it came very quickly, and I had it already. So it's been nice to share and see the reaction.
Yeah, thanks again so much for this text. And you often mention, actually, I saw this also in some texts and interviews, non-verbal modes of expression and actually creating distance from language. Can you talk a little bit about that and about your relationship? We discussed that in some of the previous conversations now, because these are text-based pieces. So it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about the relationship to language and also how a certain tension in relation to language relates to your work.
Yeah, I guess, you know, I'm first generation Australian. I grew up in a household with lots of different languages, but I was really kind of forced to speak English because I think that's what my parents wanted us to kind of be integrated into this kind of white Australian culture of speaking English, and they didn't want us to feel kind of left out. So then for me, I always said that art is my first language and English is my second, because there were so many different traditions and languages happening in my house I think that's why I found art, because I could talk most clearly through my practice. And I did always feel a bit like the odd one out, you know, with growing up in Sydney. I never felt quite one way or the other. So the art has really helped kind of find my family. Yeah.
Now also you define your work as dancing between sound, sculpture, performance and installation. And that dancing in between has happened during the lockdown, foremost in your kitchen. The kitchen has become your studio where you write and work and dance. You also work with the neighborhood, which is important. And you know, I started actually my trajectory as a curator in the kitchen, because I curated a kitchen show in 1991, which lasted 3 months and only had 29 visitors. So it was almost a semi-lockdown. It was a very tiny exhibition, and I was just curious about your kitchen and how that dancing between, which usually happens in performances, happens in the studio, how that happened in the kitchen, and what you did during the lockdown.
I think the kitchen for me is like, you know, I don't know for other people, but when you go to a house party, the kitchen is actually where everything happens. It's where the food is prepared, it's where the dancing starts, it's where I feel like that's, during lockdown, that's really where I found I could use my hands again. I was at Art Space in Woolloomooloo, and I put all my art supplies in storage because I was supposed to be in Paris at the Cité. So I was waiting for that to happen. So I had 2 months of being at home, and then we went into lockdown, and of course I'm not in Paris, I'm still in Sydney. So I found that I was using my hands, and I was cooking all this challah and giving it to my neighbors, and I was writing, and it was kind of nice to have that, actually. Of course, I'm devastated that I like to say I couldn't get off the island of Australia, but also it's kind of nice to really connect with all the artists that live on my street. I live in an area where there's lots of artists, so it's been a gift in that way.
Last question is about your unrealized project. The only recurrent question.
Yes.
Can you tell us about your unrealized project?
Well, can I say 2?
Of course, as many as you wish.
Well, I have a couple. One is maybe it's a bit cheeky to mention, but and maybe this is not just my project, but for all the women. The Art Gallery of New South Wales is, of course, building this amazing new building, the Sydney Modern. And, you know, the Art Gallery of New South Wales for me is like a home. It's like my church is where artists go. But around it, there's a list of names and they're all male. So I hope that around the new museum, there's a list of just women's names that would bring me a lot of joy. And my other project is when I was at Art Space, the St. Mary's Cathedral. I'm not necessarily religious at all, but they had this, they have the most amazing bells. And I'd love to collaborate with all the churches in the area, make a score for the church bells, which I think would be almost impossible, but hopefully one day I'll be able to do this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lauren. I hope we can continue this conversation soon. Thank you so much. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks again to Lauren. And it's now my immense pleasure to welcome Janet Laurence, who actually has created a extraordinary instruction about gently stroking a living leaf. And of course, Janet Laurence's practice often examines the physical, cultural, and conflicting relationships to the natural world. So I wanted to ask you to tell us about the genesis of your Dewey piece, of the piece to gently stroke a living leaf and feel it stroking you back. And again, we got so much feedback, so many people wrote about this piece, realized it.
Well, good evening, Hans Ulrich.
Hi.
I'm very happy to think about this origin of this work because we were deep in our lockdowns and of course we weren't allowed to touch anything. And I was also very aware about how this whole virus situation had been created because of our complete neglect of the importance of maintaining our ecosystems, and it's something I've been very concerned about all through my work. And I just recently returned from doing a show in Taiwan where I was collecting every morning in the mountains botanical material, and particularly quite strange leaves to take back into the museum to work with to create a big vitrine work. Mm-hmm. And I became, I started to build up incredible relationship with these different leaves. And I started to even think about their sleep at night and dreams and all sorts of things. And I've always sort of been scientifically kind of very interested in photosynthesis and, you know, the whole act of what the leaves are doing and their sensibility and their consciousness. And so I guess as soon as I was asked to do a work, I wanted other people to try and experience this feeling of touching a leaf and feeling cell to cell, you know, the cell of your fingers touching the cells of the leaf, and creating this kind of relationship and realizing that when you become in touch with nature, it feeds you back. And I want to kind of develop this ongoing relationship with nature, but I thought it was a good starting point, and also getting people away from their screens and into the place where you could touch things. And so I think it was just a very immediate way of, instead of just saying talk to a plant, but touch a plant, and it's still a very communicative aspect of it. So that's how it began.
Beautiful. And of course, you know, it reminded me of this amazing story which happened last year when I met Beverly Pepper, the sculptor who was in her 90s. And I met her through her daughter, Jory Graham, the poet, and invited her to participate in another project, which is a bit like Do It, which is a project of handwriting, and which I've often posted on Instagram. And actually, Beverly told us the story of a leaf, and the last couple of months of her life, she would just always have that leaf, and she would hold the leaf and go to sleep with the leaf. And so in a way, I was wondering, because in your practice, there is often this idea that art can bring us closer to nature. We spoke a lot tonight also about the importance of listening in many different ways. Can can you tell us a little bit more about how art can bring us closer to nature and about the importance of listening to nature?
Well, I think that art's a really good way to bring us in touch with nature, because often nature's not very present in art. You know, so sometimes a lot of my earlier exhibitions it was quite surprising that there were objects of nature in the gallery. I mean, even from natural history museums in the gallery. So I kind of like this thing of the strangeness of it in a gallery situation. And so I think that also you have the possibility of creating a type of aesthetic around it to bring people in touch with it in ways, you know, in the ways you want to. And I suppose at the core of my work is a real concern for caring for our nature. And so we have to love it to care for it. So I also want to bring this kind of intimacy into the work and a kind of love, you know. And so there's all sorts of different ways I've tried to do it. and you know, from actually out in the landscape, but you know, but also really more intimately inside a museum vitrine type of thing, or even I don't know, I guess I try and bring it's a caring for it. Like I had a hospital for plants, and if you see the plants on life support, like humans on you know, on different types of intensive care treatment, you have this relationship of empathy that you can suddenly understand. And in actual fact, that scientifically that what happens in plant pathology, these things do happen. So it's my way of kind of bringing this empathy and care into caring for our nature, and in the hope of healing it. And so in regard, did you say to listening to it?
Yeah, listening to plants.
Yeah, but very much so. You listen, you know, you can hear the sound, and you can amplify the sound of things like the sounds of seeds growing, the sounds of, you know, I've used a lot of sounds in nature in my work as well, but not usually like literally that particular sound, if you know what I mean. I've often divorced the sound from the actual act, but the sounds are there, and you know, the recordings of course are there. And also I listen all the time when I am in nature to the experience of our own moving through it, the different sounds of, you know, in trees, the different sounds of course of birds, and the way different sort of grasses crackle under our feet or whatever, you know. So it's a very, very important experience and perceptual experience into the research for what I want to make in the work and communicate somehow.
Last question, do you have an unrealized project?
I have, yes, a few, but I have one that's kind of probably never going to be realized, but it's already evolved, and it's an island in the Derwent River, which starts from nothing. It just starts from just rocks, and then building up a terrestrial and aquatic environment, and building up a terrestrial environment, and building up an avian environment, and waiting to see what will occur within that, ecologically, what will actually happen. And so I'm hoping it's something that will come about, and other projects too. I've got dreams of other projects of experiencing states of nature. Yeah.
Janet, thank you so much. I hope we can continue this conversation in person soon, and thanks again for your great contribution to do it. Wonderful to see you.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye. My immense pleasure. Thanks again to Janet, and my immense pleasure to introduce our last speakers for tonight. Nova Milne, a two-person artist actually based in New York City. And I wanted to begin with the beginning and ask you both to tell us about your Do It piece. It has the title 1993 and then in parentheses 2020. And 1993 is, of course, a year where many things happen, but it is also the year when actually Do It started in Paris in a conversation with Bertrand Lavier and Christian Botansky at Café Select.
That's right. So in a way, it's like, I guess the evening for most people in Australia is starting to close down, and it's very early in the morning. So in a nice way, I think it's a nice loop coming back to 1993, I suppose. So for us, in a way, an understanding that it would be read as 1993, 1993, it's kind of a cipher in a way, a projective number that we like the idea that anybody could sort of project or curate their own sense of time or space onto. So that's where that started for us. We often have like an intuitive thing that hits us for whatever reason, and so 1993 was the number for us. But yeah, as I said, it's almost like a magical cipher, and a way, an expanse, like a green screen stands in for us in our work as a materiality, a plasticity for people. And I guess instructions for us was, the idea was an interesting play on that plasticity. The idea that when you read an instruction, the very reading of it is almost like a magical tool, because I feel like I have done all the do-its that I've read to a degree. Yeah, so that was our starting point with that.
Now, it's a collaboration actually, Nova Milne. Can you tell us a little bit about how this collaboration started and how it works?
Mm-hmm. Well, it started very as very young people. We were pretty much teenagers, and it started around communing around a camera, which is also how we met, a borrowed camera from a friend. And we started a conversation, and it was also a romantic relationship that developed all at the same time, that ended up, I guess, forming something more. When we went to art, we decided to go to art school together to sort of continue this conversation, and that just sort of grew into this collage, I guess, that's a collaboration in the way that we work.
And Do It is, of course, also a living archive of so far more than 400 instructions and by practitioners from all over the world. And you often work with historic and archival material as a starting point. Can you tell us a little bit about the connection, the way you connect to archives, also in your videos,
mm-hmm. Well,
in your sound recordings?
Yes, so I guess, and drawings as well, I mean, anything really. But it's mostly sort of been held together around our video practice. And I suppose it's interesting. I think that generationally, we were from a generation where we had like videotape, our childhood, you know, in the 90s, it was all recorded on like, videotape, which was like the first really cheap way to sort of store information. And so I think that the way that we started was actually an inheritance that we received of all this material, and then started digging around it and looking at what an archive was from that perspective. And I guess that's grown now to thinking in this moment during COVID, we've sort of come so far from that now to the point where everybody really is their own archivist and their own historian. And it's effortless, really. You open your phone and you have, this is you a year ago, this is you 5 years ago, this is you, you know, this is what you were doing. And during COVID, it was interesting because I felt like we were seeing people posting, you know, that they were delving into their own archives. So you were seeing people sort of going into their histories and thinking, I guess, that palpable thing about working around time as a sort of object or sculpture is just constantly an interest for us. And that was, I guess, connected to where we went with the instruction. And I guess I guess we're interested in the sort of narrative potential of what an instruction is too, and playing with that.
And in terms of your instruction and your archive, are there any unrealized projects in your archive? Or what is your unrealized project?
Well, the archive is really just a tool for us to create sort of alternate encounters, really. And in a way, I guess the whole thing is unrealized because it's like a sea. It's like a sea of potential. But I think, you know, there is a few projects. It's hard to describe it without my partner present in a way, I think, when we start to talk about future projects. But there is this one that we've been coming back to recently because the way that we use animation and reanimate footage, we've been very interested in movement, and dance has become a huge part of recent works. And we have this idea that we keep coming back to, which we're very interested in making a live work where we actually take the format of traditional dance, where the orchestra pit, you have the stage and the orchestra pit, and we're interested in a reversal of that, and we'd love to have a sound piece on the stage and the dancers in the orchestra pit. So we've been imagining the potential of that translated from
Thank
some.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nova, Milne, and I hope again that this is the beginning of more conversations to come. And I wanted to thank you. I wanted to thank all the extraordinary artists who participated in Do It for their contribution, for wonderful participation also in the conversations tonight. I want to thank John Kaldor and the Kaldor Dream Team. I wanted to thank again also all the participants who have actually participated in Do It and send in interpretations of the instructions. I also wanted to thank, of course, all the partners, as John said in the introduction. Do It started in '93, it was then a project and still is. With ICI, we are very grateful to Renaud Roch and the ICI team. A whole new Do It version started during the lockdown with the Serpentine. I'm very grateful to Bettina Korek, to Joe Payton, to Claude Agile, and the Serpentine Dream Team, the ICI Dream Team. Of course, also Google, the Google Cultural Institute, as well as Google Arts and Culture for their collaboration of building a completely new site also for Do It. And most recently, a new Do It version started with Ruth Mackenzie at the Théâtre du Châtelet, actually, at the end of last week, which is the first time that a Do It project happens actually in a theater. Thank you all so much, and see you soon.